Legends of Vancouver by E. Pauline Johnson. This is the 8th edition, illustrated, published by Saturday Sunset Press, Vancouver, BC, 1913, even though the copyright is a 1911. And these legends are printed by courtesy of the Vancouver Daily Province, in which journal they first appeared. Preface. I have been asked to write a preface to these Legends of Vancouver, which, in conjunction with the members of the publication subcommittee, Mrs. Leafrey, Mr. L.W. Makovinsky, and R.W. Douglas, I have helped put through the press, but scarcely any prefatory remarks are necessary. This book may well stand on its own merits. Still, it may be permissible to record one's glad satisfaction that a poet has arisen to cast over the shoulders of our gray mountains, our trail-threaded forests, our tide-swept waters, and the streets and skyscrapers of our hurrying city a gracious mantle of romance. Pauline Johnson has linked the vivid present with the immemorial past. Vancouver takes on a new aspect as we view it through her eyes. In the imaginative power that she has brought to these semi-historical sagas, and in the liquid flow of her rhythmic prose, she has shown herself to be a literary worker of whom we may well be proud. She has made a most estimable contribution to purely Canadian literature. Bernard McAvoy. Author's Forward. These legends, with 2 or 3 exceptions, were told to me personally by my honored friend, the late Chief Joe Capilano of Vancouver, whom I had the privilege of first meeting in London in 1906, when he visited England and was received at Buckingham Palace by their Majesties King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. To the fact that I was able to greet Chief Capilano in the Chinook tongue, while we were both many thousands of miles from home, I owe the friendship and confidence which he so freely gave me when I came to reside on the Pacific coast. These legends he told me from time to time, just as the mood possessed him, and he frequently remarked that they had never been revealed to any other English-speaking person, save myself. E. Pauline Johnson. Tekanahuan Wake. Biographical note. E. Pauline Johnson, Tekna Wake, is the youngest child of a family of 4 born to the late G. H. M. Johnson, Okanawashion, head chief of the Six Nations Indians, and his wife, Emily St. Howells. The latter was of English parentage, her birthplace being Bristol, but the land of her adoption, Canada. Chief Johnson was of the renowned Mohawk tribe, being a scion of one of the 50 noble families which compose the historical confederation founded by Hiawatha upwards of 400 years ago, and known at that period as the Brotherhood of the Five Nations, but which was afterwards named the Iroquois by the early French missionaries and explorers. For their loyalty to the British Crown, they were granted the magnificent lands bordering the Grand River in the country of Brant, Ontario, on which the tribes still live. It was upon this reserve, on her father's estate, Chiefswoods, that Pauline Johnson was born. The loyalty of her ancestors breathes in her prose as well as in her poetic writings. Her education was neither extensive nor elaborate. It embraced neither high school nor college. A nursery governess for 2 years at home, 3 years at a Indian day school half a mile from her home, and 2 years in the central school of the city of Brantford was the extent of her educational training. But, besides this, she acquired a wide general knowledge, having been through childhood and early girlhood a great reader, especially of poetry. Before she was 12 years old, she had read Scott, Longfellow, Byron, Shakespeare, and such books as Addison's Spectator, Foster's Essays, and Owen Meredith's writing. The first periodicals to accept her poems and place them before the public were Gems of Poetry, a small magazine published in New York, and The Week, established by the late Professor Goldwin Smith of Toronto, the New York Independent, and Toronto Saturday Night. Since then, she has contributed most of the high grade to most of the high grade magazines, both on this continent and in England. Her writings have been brought her writings have brought her into notice. The next step in Miss Johnson's career was her appearance on the public platform as a reciter of her own poems. For this she had natural talent, and in the exercise of it she soon developed a marked ability, joined with a personal magnetism, that was destined to make her a favorite with audiences from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Her friend, Mr. Frank E. of Toronto, provided for a series of recitals having that scope, with the object of enabling her to go to England to arrange for the publication of her poems. Within 2 years this aim was accomplished, her book of poems, The White Wampum, being published by John Lane of Bodley Head. She took with her numerous letters of introduction, including one from the Governor-General, the Earl of Aberdeen, and soon she gained both social and literary standing. Her book was received with much favor both by reviewers and the public. After giving many recitals in fashionable drawing rooms, she returned to Canada and made her first tour to the Pacific coast, giving recitals at all the cities and towns en route. Since then she has crossed the Rocky Mountains no fewer than 19 times. Miss Johnson's pen had not been idle, and in 1903 the Geo N. Moranco of Toronto published her second book of poems entitled Canadian Born, which was also well received. After a number of recitals, which included Newfoundland and the Maritime Provinces, she went to England again in 1906 and made her first appearance in Steinway Hall under the distinguished patronage of Lord and Lady Strathcona. In the following year she again visited London, returning by way of the United States, where she gave many recitals. After another tour of Canada, she decided to give up public work, to make Vancouver, BC, her home, and to devote herself to literary work. Only a woman of remarkable powers of endurance could have borne up under the hardships necessarily encountered in traveling through the northwest Canada in pioneer days, as Miss Johnson did, and shortly after settling down in Vancouver, the exposure and hardship she had endured began to tell on her, and her health completely broke down. For almost a year she has been an invalid, and as she is unable to attend to the business herself, a trust has been formed by some of the leading citizens of her adopted city for the purpose of collecting and publishing for her benefit her later works. Among these are the beautiful Indian legends contained in this volume, which she has been at great pains to collect, and a series of boys' stories which have been exceedingly well received by magazine readers. During the 16 years Miss Johnson was traveling, she had many varied and interesting experiences. She traveled the old Battleford Trail before the railway went through, and across the boundary country in British Columbia in the romantic days of the early pioneers. Once she took an 850-mile drive up the Caribou Trail to the goldfields. She has always been an ardent canoeist, and has run many strange rivers, crossed many a lonely lake, and camped in many an unfrequented place. These venturesome trips she made more from her inherent love of nature and adventure than from any necessity of her profession. Miss Pauline Johnson died in Vancouver on March the 7th, 1913. In accordance with her last wish, her ashes were buried in Stanley Park within sight and sound of Siwash Rock, where the main drive round the park, coming from the English Bay entrance, divides east and west, the western branch sloping down towards the rock and eastern going to the Big Tree. An editorial in the Vancouver Daily Province of March the 8th said, "The keynote of her whole disposition was a generous charity towards everything and everybody with whom she came in contact. There was no trouble too great for her to take, no detail too small for her to neglect, when it was a matter of giving happiness to others. She was one of those great souls who would starve themselves on the trail, work unwearyingly," transcriber's note, unwearyingly, "for her companions' cheer, them ever onwards through good times and bad, and rejoice with them when the goal was achieved. She loved life with a passionate devotion that was almost pathetic in its intensity. In spite of all her traveling, all her experience, which were by no means easy, Pauline Johnson never lost her capacity for getting the best out of life. She was absolutely natural and simple in her love of happiness. She disliked artificiality of any kind. The seasons as they came and went were in themselves a constant source of pleasure to her. She loved the Pacific coast with its ever-changing colors, the sea and the deeply gashed mountains. The wind in the great firs and the roaring of the mountain torrents were music in her ears. With the passing of winter passed also the soul of Pauline Johnson to the happy hunting grounds, there to find eternal freedom untrammeled by mortality. To all who knew her, she was the best beloved vagabond. It was always fine weather and good going on the trail of life when Pauline Johnson blazed the way.